Hello and welcome to Finding Your Holy Grail, a show produced through Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. I am your host, Dr. Mandy Simon. I'm very excited to introduce today our special guest, Mhairi Morrison, who has an incredible background, but she is here to talk to us today specifically about our show and its goals, which is to help provide you practical tools to move forward that allow you to build resilience from within. Mhairi, welcome.
Thank you very much. Hi, Mandy.
Hi. Would you like to start out talking to our audience a little bit about your background so they understand who you are, maybe even where you've been living and where you're living now would help?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm very happy to be here. And my name is Mhairi, as you said, even though it's a Gaelic Scottish spelling. That H is a bit of a red herring in my name. And I'm an actress. I started my career here in Scotland, and then I moved to Paris and did mime and acrobatics and worked in theatre in France. Then moved to London and worked in film and television and theatre, and then moved to Los Angeles. I was in LA for 11 years and did some stand-up comedy, created my own web series that's now on Amazon Prime, and did a mime show and learned how to teach yoga, which I taught with goats for several years. And now I find myself in Scotland during this pandemic. I came back here at the end of April and have been in the northeast of Scotland since then. I am in transit to move back to London, but currently I am in Scotland, Aberdeenshire.
Yeah, very nice. And I, at this time, am also in Scotland, which is really fun.
Yes.
And have just come from America as well. In fact, we had this similar experience of what it was like to try to move in the midst of a pandemic.
Yes.
So for all of you and our audience at home who's had this experience, we definitely understand. And it doesn't matter who's doing it, it's very difficult. So, yeah.
Yes, it's good to have a yoga practice when you're doing that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we really talked about was exactly this. The yoga practice has something that allows you to recognize that you can go within yourself to try to find a way through your days, regardless of the uncertainty. One of the biggest things that we're dealing with now is this pandemic of fear, as I like to refer to it. And, you know, from my clinical perspective, it can be more deadly than the virus itself. And so the thing that got you and I talking and connected and really brought you to the stage here with us today is this wonderful bead movement that you started. And I would be so delighted if you could share this with our audience.
Sure. Yes. I love talking about it as the bead movement because it sounds so grand, and effectively it's two of us that are doing it. But I feel like it's like a global event, which it has been global because my friend who I do it with is in Sweden. So we are a global movement. Yes, over 6 years ago now, about 6.5 years ago, I stumbled upon an article where a man was talking. He was in his late 40s and he had a very serious illness, which had been a moment of thinking, was he going to survive it? And as a result of that, he did survive it, but he then, as from having gone through this experience, thought that he would count how many days he would have left to live in his life if he lived to the life expectancy as a man in the UK. And he discovered that he had about 9,500 days left in the best case scenario, effectively, if he lived to the average age. And I remember reading that article, and then what he did was he thought, I'm going to take a number of beads. I'm going to take that 9,000 days and represent that in 9,000 beads. And every morning take a bead out of the jar of 9,000 and put it in another jar, and thereby being very conscious of the time spent and how you are effectively going through the days of your life. And I was so moved by that on so many reasons. One, that I had just kind of assumed that I would have many more days than just 9,000. I mean, obviously I was younger than him at the time, but I still felt like we've just got well, I'd never posed that question to myself, how many days I might have left.
Yeah.
But the thought that you only might have a few thousand, it just was quite shocking to actually put a limit on your days, you know, without just thinking they're sort of endlessly there for you. And so I started thinking about that. I spoke to my friend Johanna, we had dinner and we thought, let's do it. And so there began the Bead Movement. But instead of shooting just for the life expectancy in our country, Sweden is a better place to live if you're looking for higher life expectancy. So she had more days than I had anyway, but I thought I'm going to shoot for 100. So we went to downtown Los Angeles and bought that number of beads. I was shooting for 100. So at that point I was buying 19,900 beads. And that in itself was quite an event to find beads, to even think what kind of beads you would want, to actually have a visual representation of your life. That's very meaningful. What do you want to show? So I chose some pearls which have a personal meaning for me, and also I thought timeless. I didn't want something neon that I might think was good now, but when I'm 80 think, oh, that was a bad choice. So I wanted something timeless. And so we bought that, and then I counted out my 19,000 beads, put it in a jar. We got very clear on how we wanted to live our lives, which in itself is a good exercise to think, what's your paradigm for living, essentially. And we had similar things, but for me, it's things like living with grace and with courage. And sometimes, certainly some of these words feel a bit abstract or a bit lofty or a bit, well, courage, yes, if there's an earthquake and I am there, I will, rescue a child from a building, and I will do that. That'll be my moment to be courageous. But obviously, hopefully that never happens. But how can you be courageous in your day as opposed to waiting for a big event to showcase that? So questioning that.
Yeah, I love hearing this. And what was this like when you went through this with your friend and you were having these experiences of being in the shop where you were deciding, well, what kind of bead represents you, for one thing, right? I mean, this is a really interesting thing to hear. We've spoken about your experience with the bead movement before, but I've not heard this part about the pearl and then, your thought process about it being timeless. I think this is really very interesting. Like, what kind of container holds 19,000 beads?
Mandy, that is such a good question. And it did take several weeks to find one. And as Johanna kept saying, make sure you've got a lid so it doesn't get dusty, the beads, because obviously you're having this sense that you're going to have this for decades, but clearly, you might not live that long. And so, we actually both felt nauseous with the magnitude of it. And it took us by surprise. Johanna's from a very rural area of Sweden, so she had a sense of wanting to get wooden beads, to get something that is of the earth type thing. And I had no picture in my mind. I thought I would just see something and be drawn to it. And the area that we went to in Los Angeles is the fashion district, so they have just mountains of any kind of beads you would ever imagine. And what was interesting was I chose pale pink pearls because my aunt, who sadly passed away when she was 37, which was the age that I was at that time, and when I started the bead movement, and my aunt had left me pearls. And so my aunt had been very present in my mind that year, and so when I saw these pearls, I thought, I'm going to get this, and because it's going to link me to my aunt. And then I love Chanel, and Chanel is all about pearls, and so those were the reasons. But then I met somebody who was this kind of shamanic person, and he said, do you know what the actual significance of a pale pink pearl is? And I said, not beyond my own personal connection. And then I went home, and he said, go home and Google it. And I did. And it means overcoming adversity, especially overcoming sexual adversity, which I have done as a survivor of sexual assault. So I feel I was drawn to something that ultimately became extremely significant for me. And seeing that I had 19,900 representations of strength and overcoming adversity was very empowering.
Thank you for sharing this story with us. I think what is so phenomenal to me in being able to hear what you're saying is that it goes far beyond for us as human beings about why we're drawn to certain things. And this example of the shamanic individual saying to you, go home and Google what is the symbolism behind a pink pearl, and recognizing that it was so closely tied in to the representation of why you are living a life full of courage each day and intention, is a phenomenal statement of what we don't even understand that's unseen in our world every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your rationalization, as you're saying it, is that you like Chanel, you're on this, these types of things, and we don't understand these deeper meanings. And partially the reason that I've created this space with my co-creator is so that we can start to explore what are these things that really drive us forward as human beings, and allow us to understand that we have something so deep inside of us that we can connect with, that give us hope of a new day that looks so completely different from what our current day looks like, regardless of what that is for each person. And I find this to just be such an incredibly moving and instructive example of how our audience at home, make no mistake, this is your call to action. This is your challenge, which is, firstly, can you decide how long you're going to live? And when you decide how long you're going to live, can you look at it with intention and represent it in such a way that you can tell us what it's like when you have the beads in one jar, and then what happens at the end of the day?
Yeah, let me tell you, it took Johanna and I totally by surprise. I had no idea how this would affect me. I really didn't. I thought, just having read about how this man did this, and then I'll do it and it'll be something nice. But it is such an impactful thing. I mean, I had somebody film me the first time I put a bead in, which was August 1st, 2014. And as you drop that bead in, I had this sense of, well, where am I going to be when I drop the last bead in of my life? I mean, clearly, actually, that could have been the first and the last. I could have died that day. So it's a very profound thing. And so every morning I have an intention, and sometimes that can be for a month. I'm wanting to live with grace. So it's thinking grace. Even that happened today. I'm working on grace this week, and somebody told me a joke that wasn't very funny, but I thought to be graceful, to have grace, to laugh and not make that person feel weird or bad, or bad sense of humor. So it reminds you of your intention. And it's what I find the most meaningful thing, which I'm going to do this week, because I have been without my beads for the last 7 months because they've been in transit with my other belongings from America to the UK. So I have to now count how many days I haven't put beads in, which will be significant, like 200 or something, and then put those beads in all together in the used jar. And that is so meaningful. I mean, I've never done 7 months worth of beads, but if I do like a week or 2 weeks when I haven't been with my beads, there's something about the number when you're counting, say, 14 beads into this big jar, and just thinking, oh my gosh, I really hope that I lived those days well, because I can't get them back. And my jar of the used beads, I literally can't put my hand in. And my 6-year-old niece came around the other day, and she looked at the jar of beads of the ones that I had already used the day spent, and she said, oh, can I take a bead out of there? And I said, no, those are my days gone, done, finished. You have no second chances. And it's a very deep moment, because every day you're questioning, which is because I don't want to live a life where I'm coasting or apathetic, or that I'm not aware of the value of a day, essentially. I mean, it's hard to say that without sounding like you're just repeating a cliche, but there is something about doing that movement of putting in something and seeing a physical representation that is very profound.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think what's so interesting from my perspective is this aspect of, I mean, we've both, as we said in the beginning, been on the road living from the same suitcase since March because of the pandemic and sort of what has been happening. And to think about what it must have been like after hearing you relay this story, to pack your beads into one space, hoping that you would be reunited with them, and then having to go through 200 of them, and what your thought process must have been to be without them during that time, and trying to be as intentional as possible. It's quite a interesting aspect.
Yeah, and I think especially to be without them during a time of a pandemic, which is probably the time that you need it the most, which
Yeah.
because you obviously feel totally out of control because the parameters are out of your control right now, you know, with new rules and things going in. And the one thing that I felt the effects of the bead movement almost immediately after I started was a sense of relief on my life, that I am in control of my own paradigms for living through grace and through courage and the other things that I thought of, irrespective of external circumstance. But you know, because before that, honestly, there was a lot of my life as an actor and a producer that I would think, when my show gets picked up, I'll be really happy. When this happens, and that's all out with my control. Whereas starting each day again with courage, with grace, with strength, those are all things that are in my control. Whether I live a day full of grace or not is totally irrelevant, whether the BBC greenlight my show or not. I mean, not to say I don't want them to greenlight my show. I do, and that would be
I completely get it. I completely get it. It's so beautifully conveyed. And for those of you who are watching, we can see this in your body language. We can see how meaningful it is to you. For those of you who are listening, you can hear it in your voice.
Thank you.
And yeah, this is what is so uniquely important for us as humans, is that we can take this time to reflect on how did this improve our lives. And the thing that I always say is that the only thing I have control over is my reaction to a situation. Yeah. And this is what you're saying, and what we understand about the human body and the way that it functions and the way that we can thrive as individuals and not just survive, is for us to have an understanding, not of perceived power over our lives, but actual power of choice. And that even the small things of placing a bead from one jar into another with intention each day clearly has this effect in your life in beautiful ways.
Well, thank you. Yes, and I think it broadens you. At least our experience was also, it makes you, things might not look as you think they are going to look cerebrally, but to be open to that being different. You know, there was one moment quite soon after I started the bead movement where I had been extremely disappointed. I hadn't gotten a work opportunity which would have allowed me to go back to London and go to a friend's wedding and have this work. And so I was feeling pretty low this one particular day, but I was crossing a street near to where I live in LA, and it was an amazing sunset. And I turned to a valet guy standing outside this restaurant and just said, "Look at the sunset, isn't it amazing?" You know, there's something about sunsets or sunrise, you feel that you need to share them and say, "Isn't this amazing?" And so we were both looking at the sunset. And then I started to walk back down the street, and he shouted up to me. He said, "You're the one that told me to look at the stars the other night," which was true. I'd also seen amazing stars. And he said, "Thank you for saying that." And I had felt so low, and I turned away from him, and my heart, I almost started crying, because I was thinking, gosh, my actual family aren't here, and my dear friends who I'd hoped to see in London, but actually the valet guys at the end of my road, who I've now shared 2 celestial moments in a few days, are there for me. And remember, you know, and I just felt like this level of warmth, that things might not look how you anticipate they ought to look, family and scenario, but they are still there. You just need to, the scales can drop from your eyes, and you know that you can share moments with people that can surprise you, essentially strangers, but not really. Now was the sky girl from was crossing the road, a great sky moment.
It's such a beautiful story to share, and it's really appropriate. It helps us to understand, well, you know, I mean, for all intents and purposes, many people on the globe now are being asked to shelter in place, and so people are feeling so physically distanced and socially isolated. And you know, this was the motivation of you feeling so low, and yet you were able to turn this around through just this interaction with this individual in your day. It's beautiful. I'm really grateful for you for sharing this. Yeah, it's really nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really nice. And I think now would be a really lovely time for you to just share with our audience how they can follow you and find out what you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. The Bead Movement is online. It is the beadmovement.com, bead with a D, not beat. There is something called the Bead Movement, but this is definitely the bead.
Yeah.
And Johanna and I, we were blogging about it every week for 3 years, and we had a pause, and now we started blogging again as a result, basically, of what we're going through in the pandemic. So that the beadmovement.com, and that has Johanna and I's also, websites linked and listed there too. So that would be a place to go to find us, thebeadmovement.com.
Great. And I think, for our audience at home, when I have looked at your website, MhairiMorrison.com as well, correct?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. It really, so that's www. And spell your name for everyone at home.
Yes, thank you for it's at MhairiMorrison.com. So it's MhairiMorrison.com.
Yeah.
Mhairi, and then Morrison, like Jim or Van.
Yeah, exactly.
With them.
And what is so impressive to me is the sheer amount of work that you create, you produce, you stand behind, your activism, which is just phenomenal. And it just gives me pause every time I watch your Don't Silence Me video. It's just really incredible. And it's phenomenal, the courage and vision that you show in life every day. And you're just such an absolute inspiration. And so I encourage anyone at home, and when you follow this link to watch the show, all of your links are there. So I really encourage people to check out your work and to get involved. It's just phenomenal what you've done already. And I really look forward to the next work that you create. And I'm so grateful for you joining us today. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. What amazing, kind words you just said. And I shall replay those on a bad day. I will keep this recording. Thank you.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, please do. And I would like to thank at this time Passionate World Talk Radio for providing a platform on their internet radio station for our show, Finding Your Holy Grail. To find out more about Finding Your Holy Grail, go to www.findingyourholygrail.com, and Passionate World Talk Radio is www.passionateworldtalkradio.com. For all of our audience, viewers, and listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Please take this call to action, start your bead practice, and find out how it can actually change your life. Until next week, keep safe and stay brave.